Cold. Not the kind that merely makes your fingers tremble, but the kind that seeps into your bones and settles there, refusing to leave. That was the air inside a monk's cell in the Middle Ages. They called it home, though it was barely more than a stone box with a slit in the wall pretending to be a window. The walls were rough and damp, always smelling faintly of mildew, and in winter the moisture would turn to a thin sheet of ice along the edges of the stones. Every breath hung visible in the air, a ghostly reminder that warmth was a luxury they had given up long ago. The thin blanket on the cot, if you could call it a blanket, was stiff from years of use, the fabric worn smooth by countless cold nights. The floor was uneven stone, sometimes slick from the condensation that gathered there, and stepping on it barefoot in the early morning was like plunging your feet into a frozen river. The sound inside these walls was not silence, but something heavier, an absence of life. Outside, the world might be full of birdsong, clattering carts, the laughter of children, but here, those noises were smothered before they could reach you. All that remained was the occasional drip of water from the ceiling and the low groan of wood as the building shifted in the wind. The monks moved quietly in the corridors, their sandals slapping the floor in a slow, deliberate rhythm. No one spoke unless it was absolutely necessary. Even a cough could feel like an intrusion. It was a place that stripped away distractions, and perhaps that was the point. The less you had to cling to, the more you clung to faith, or so they were told. But faith in a cell like this felt less like a warm embrace and more like a test that never ended. There were no possessions to comfort you, no personal items tucked away in a drawer. A small wooden cross might hang on the wall, its edges smooth from being touched during countless whispered prayers, but beyond that, the cell was bare. It was a deliberate emptiness, meant to remind the monk that his purpose was not to live for himself, but for the words he would copy and the God he served. In winter, the stone walls trapped the cold so completely that the cell felt like the inside of a tomb. Monks would sometimes wake with frost on their robes, their breath thick in the air, their fingers stiff before the day's work even began. In summer, the air grew heavy and stale, but it was still dim, the single slit of light never enough to chase away the shadows. The cell was not a place of comfort. It was a place of stripping away every luxury, every indulgence, until all that remained was discipline. If you've been traveling through this story with me, imagine how many more journeys we can take together. Go ahead and subscribe so the next chapter finds you the moment it's ready. And while you're here, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? And the strange thing was, some of them grew attached to it. After years inside, the world outside the monastery began to feel too loud, too chaotic. The cell, for all its misery, was predictable. It did not surprise you with danger or joy. It simply existed, as constant and unyielding as the stone it was made from. And maybe that predictability was the most dangerous comfort of all. But every day began the same, no matter the season. Long before the first hint of sunlight touched the horizon, a bell would ring in the darkness. It was not a pleasant sound. It was sharp, metallic, and absolute. The moment it struck, sleep was over, whether your body was ready or not. Monks would rise from their cots without complaint, not because they were well rested, but because hesitation was unthinkable. They moved like shadows, pulling on their robes, adjusting the rope belts at their waists, stepping out into corridors that were just as cold as their cells. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the kitchen fires that would be lit much later. But in those early hours there was nothing to eat, nothing to drink, only prayer. They would walk in silence to the chapel, the flicker of oil lamps casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the world was still asleep, but inside, the chanting would begin, low and deep, a sound that felt older than the stones themselves. The prayers were not rushed. They unfolded slowly, each word drawn out until it became almost a hum. You could feel it in your chest more than you could hear it. This was the rhythm of their lives, a cycle of waking, praying, working, and returning to that small, cold cell at the end of the day. And yet, in those early moments, when the air was heavy with incense and the light was just beginning to break through the windows of the chapel, there was a strange beauty. It wasn't the beauty of comfort or joy, it was the beauty of surrender. Every monk in that room had chosen to leave behind the warmth of family, the noise of the market, the simple pleasure of breaking bread with friends. Here, there was only the work, the discipline, and the unshakable belief that each sacrifice, each letter copied by hand, was an offering that reached beyond the walls of the monastery. It was this life, this cold and quiet existence that shaped everything else they did. The hours spent hunched over a manuscript, the pain in the back, the ache in the eyes, the endless repetition of prayers, it all began in that cell. That was where the mind was sharpened, where the heart was emptied of distractions, and where the soul was trained to endure. And endurance, more than talent or inspiration, was what a monk needed most, because what waited for them after those morning prayers was not the warmth of a fire or the comfort of a meal, but the long punishing hours with ink and parchment, where a single mistake could undo an entire day's labor. Ink was not simply bought in neat little bottles. In the Middle Ages, it was born out of stubbornness, patience, and a strange willingness to stain your hands for life. The monks didn't stroll into a shop to choose a shade. They created their ink from scratch, and the recipe was part science, part ritual. The base was often made from soot scraped from the insides of chimneys, a fine black dust clinging to stone like a shadow that refused to leave. This soot was mixed with vinegar so sharp it could make your eyes water, not for flavor, but to help bind the particles together. And then came the binding agent, gum arabic, a resin harvested from acacia trees, sticky and stubborn, melting slowly when warmed. The result was a dark, almost oily liquid that clung to the quill like a secret that didn't want to be told. But this ink carried more than just pigment. The monks believed every drop was a piece of labor offered to God. That's why they treated the process with reverence, even when it meant hours of grinding soot between stones until the air turned gritty and your fingertips were permanently gray. The smell was sharp, a mix of smoke and acid, and it would settle into their robes so deeply that no amount of washing in cold well water could erase it. Some monks even joked, quietly when the abbot wasn't around, that the ink was made of fuligem e arrepentimiento, soot and regret, because each letter copied felt like both an act of devotion and a reminder of how endless their task truly was. There were no shortcuts. If the ink dried out, you didn't throw it away. You coaxed it back to life, adding drops of vinegar, stirring until it was smooth again. If the mixture was too thick, the quill would scratch and tear the parchment. Too thin, and the letters would fade before the page was finished. This balance became an obsession. A monk could spend half an hour adjusting the ink before even touching a pen to page, because a mistake here meant more than just wasted time. It meant an entire sheet of precious parchment ruined, an expensive loss that could not be ignored. And parchment was not paper. It was animal skin, usually calf or sheep, scraped, stretched, and smoothed until it was pale and almost luminous. To waste it was a sin in itself. That's why the ink had to be perfect, not just in color, but in permanence. The monks aimed for a black that would outlast them, words that would still be readable centuries later. They didn't know it then, but many of those pages are still here, the ink dark as the day it was laid down, while the hands that wrote it have long since turned to dust. Working with this ink wasn't gentle. It clung to the quill in tiny trembling drops, and the monk had to dip again and again, never letting his hand tremble too much or press too hard. A single blotch could ruin the symmetry of the page. Imagine spending 8 hours on a single column of text and, in the final line, watching a careless drip of ink bloom like a spreading bruise across the parchment. Some monks, so frustrated by such accidents, would scrape the spot gently with a sharp knife, trying to lift the stain. But parchment had its limits. Scrape too deep, and you'd leave a hole, a wound in the page that could never be healed. There's a strange intimacy in making and using ink this way. It isn't just a tool, it's a companion in the work, one you must tend to constantly. If the ink thickened in the winter chill, the monk would warm it near a candle, careful not to scorch it. If it thinned in the summer heat, he'd store it in the coolest corner of the scriptorium, shaded from the light. The ink aged with the work, changing slightly in tone and texture over the days, until the page you finished looked subtly different from the one you started. To the casual reader centuries later, every letter might seem uniform, but the monk would have known where the ink felt heavier, where it flowed like water, and where it fought him every step of the way. And still, there was something strangely satisfying in watching the page fill up, the black letters standing out sharp and proud against the creamy surface of the parchment. Each stroke was a tiny victory over the resistance of the materials. The quill's stubborn split tip, the ink's unpredictable flow, the parchment's slight pull beneath the hand. It was a slow battle fought in silence, and one that could not be rushed without risk. But here's the truth. The ink was only half the struggle. The other half was the quill itself, fragile, fickle, and in constant need of trimming. The monk could prepare the perfect ink, but if the quill faltered, the line would waver, the letters would suffer, and the work would lose its beauty. And beauty, in a manuscript, was not decoration, it was a sign of devotion, proof that the words had been given the honor they deserved. And so, with the ink ready and the tools prepared, the monk would take a deep breath, set the tip to parchment, and begin the day's labor. The first line had to be flawless, not just for the reader, but for himself. It set the tone for the hours ahead. And as the letters began to take shape, his mind would settle into the rhythm, each stroke a step deeper into the quiet world of the scriptorium, where mistakes could cost dearly and perfection was the only acceptable goal. Fasting was not an occasional act of devotion for the medieval monk. It was a way of life. The body was not meant to be indulged. It was meant to be subdued, disciplined until it obeyed without question. Meals were small, plain, and predictable, often consisting of bread so hard it had to be soaked in broth, thin vegetable soups, and the occasional fish on special days. Meat from four-legged animals was forbidden for many orders, seen as too indulgent, too rich for a servant of God. Hunger wasn't an accident. It was the point. The constant dull ache in the stomach was a reminder that comfort belonged to the soul, not the flesh. The fasting had a rhythm, woven into the calendar of the church. Lent was the great test. Weeks of restriction, where even the modest meals of daily life were cut back further, sometimes to one main meal a day, taken in silence. But there were also dozens of other fast days scattered across the year, marking saints' feasts, vigils, and holy days. This meant that for large portions of the year, a monk's body was running on less than it needed. And still, the work continued. Hours of copying texts, hours of chanting in the chapel, hours of labor in the gardens or kitchens. The body adapted, but never forgot its hunger. It wasn't just the fasting. It was the abstinence from every form of physical pleasure. Celibacy wasn't a polite suggestion, it was a vow, one that reached beyond avoiding sex. It meant avoiding touch itself, avoiding intimacy of any kind that might stir the senses. The human need for closeness was starved in the same way the body was starved of food. This was deliberate. To the medieval monastic mind, every indulgence was a chain binding the soul to the earth, and the goal was to cut every chain. Desire was a dangerous thing. It distracted from prayer, clouded the mind, and tempted the heart away from God. The combination of hunger and abstinence created a particular kind of clarity, or perhaps it was a particular kind of delirium. There were monks who claimed that during long fasts, their prayers became sharper, their visions clearer. Whether this was divine insight or simply the result of a body pushed to the edge is impossible to know, but it shaped the way they saw their sacrifices. To endure constant hunger and the absence of all worldly pleasure was to strip life down to its barest form. Every day became a small death to the self, and every act of obedience a preparation for the eternal life they sought. But discipline of this kind didn't come without cost. There were fainting spells during long services, hands trembling over parchment after hours without sustenance. In the cold months, when the fast coincided with freezing winds that seeped through the monastery walls, the combination could be brutal. Malnutrition left its mark: sunken eyes, pale skin, weakened muscles. But these signs were worn almost with pride. They were physical proof of spiritual commitment, badges of endurance in a life meant to be hard. And yet, there was no sense of pity within the cloister for this suffering. In fact, there was a certain suspicion toward those who seemed too healthy, too comfortable. A plump monk might be seen as spiritually lax, too willing to take advantage of loopholes in the rules. Those who endured their hunger quietly, who showed no outward complaint, earned a silent respect. In this way, the monastery's discipline was self-reinforcing. The more the body suffered, the more the community believed the soul was advancing. This rejection of bodily comfort also shaped the way they approached their work. A scribe who was hungry, who denied himself even the comfort of leaning back from the desk for too long, was thought to be less distracted, more focused on the holy task in front of him. The discomfort itself became a form of prayer. Each hunger pang an offering, each moment of temptation resisted a quiet victory. And there were temptations, small but real. The scent of bread baking in the kitchen could drift into the scriptorium in the late morning, stirring thoughts that had nothing to do with the Psalms or the Gospels. The flicker of a memory, a family meal, a lover's touch from a life before the monastery might rise unexpectedly during a long vigil. These were the moments the vows were truly tested. It wasn't in the public rituals, but in the private battles no one else could see. The decision to turn the mind back to prayer, to remind the body that it no longer ruled here. Still, there were whispers among some that the strictness could go too far. Stories circulated of monks collapsing in the fields or dying during Lent from the combination of fasting and cold. Some abbots quietly allowed small concessions, an extra piece of bread for the elderly, a small portion of meat for the sick. But these exceptions were rare and often carried the weight of guilt. Even those granted relief might feel they were failing in their commitment. The logic was clear. The body was temporary, fragile, and unreliable. The soul, on the other hand, was eternal, and every sacrifice of the flesh was an investment in that eternity. In a world where life expectancy was short and death a constant companion, this was not just a spiritual belief, it was a practical one. The monk's life was a preparation for dying well, for meeting the afterlife with a clean heart and an unshaken will. And in the quiet of the cloister, when the hunger gnawed and the cold bit into the skin, there was one more vow to uphold: silence. Because in the monastery, suffering was not to be shouted about or even whispered. It was to be endured in stillness, each man locked in his own discipline, his own battle. And it was in that silence that the next challenge awaited, the unrelenting demand for perfection, not just in spirit, but in the very shape of every letter they wrote. Perfection was not a lofty ideal in the scriptorium. It was a demand as unyielding as the stone walls around it. The work of a monk scribe was measured not in pages produced, but in precision achieved. Every curve, every flourish of a letter had to match the standard of the manuscript being copied. This was not handwriting as we know it. It was a form of architecture. Each letter was constructed with balance and proportion, its height and width determined by rules older than the man writing them. To deviate from these rules was not just an error. It was a blemish on a work meant to honor God. We've walked through cold stone halls and turned the pages of history side by side. If you'd like to keep uncovering these hidden worlds with me, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And I'm curious, From what corner of the world are you joining us today? The tools themselves made perfection both possible and punishing. The quill was sharp, its tip cut at a precise angle to control the flow of ink. Too sharp, and it could tear the delicate surface of the parchment. Too dull, and the lines would blur, robbing the letters of their clarity. The monk would pause often to trim the quill with a small knife, tiny shavings of feather falling to the desk like snow. Every cut was a gamble. One wrong movement and the quill would be ruined, forcing him to start the shaping process again from scratch. The act of writing was slow, deliberate. The monk's wrist barely moved. It was the fingers that guided the strokes, each motion restrained, almost meditative. The ink flowed in measured amounts, and with every dip of the quill into the inkwell came the risk of a blot. A single blot could ruin an entire sheet, hours of work erased in an instant. Sometimes a small mistake could be scraped away with the blade of a knife, but parchment had limits. It could only endure so much correction before the surface became weak and unusable. The pressure was constant, but it wasn't just about avoiding mistakes. The writing had to be beautiful. This was a sacred duty because, in the medieval mind, beauty was not a luxury. It was a reflection of divine order. A manuscript with sloppy lettering was not just unpleasant to look at, it was an offense to the sacred words it contained. That belief weighed on the scribe's shoulders as heavily as any vow. His work was not signed, his name not preserved, but the quality of the manuscript would stand for centuries, carrying his invisible reputation into the future. And the work was not done in comfort. The scriptorium was cold in winter, stuffy in summer, and always filled with the faint scent of ink and parchment. The light came from narrow windows or oil lamps that smoked and sputtered, staining the air with a bitter tang. Shadows played across the pages, and the strain on the eyes was constant. Some monks developed a permanent hunch from the hours spent leaning forward, their necks and shoulders aching by midday. Their fingers cramped, their eyes burned, and yet the expectation of perfection never lessened. There were no distractions allowed. Talking was forbidden unless necessary, and even then, it was done in hushed tones. The only sounds were the scratching of quills, the occasional creak of a chair, and the soft rustle of parchment being turned. It was a silence that amplified every small mistake. A quill catching on the page was loud in that room. A blot of ink seemed to spread in slow motion under the unblinking gaze of the work. And yet, some monks found a strange peace in this discipline. The focus required left no room for wandering thoughts, the repetition of forms, the steady rhythm of the hand, the neat filling of each line. It could lull the mind into a state that felt almost like prayer. For others, however, it was a constant battle against fatigue and frustration. A day's work might yield only a page or two, and in the evening, when they returned to their cold cells, there was no sense of relief, only the knowledge that tomorrow would demand the same precision all over again. Mistakes did happen, of course. Sometimes they were small, an extra letter, a slight tilt in the line. Other times they were disastrous. Entire pages had to be redone, and the loss of expensive parchment was a serious matter. There are manuscripts today with visible corrections, places where a scribe tried to save the page by reworking the mistake into an ornate decoration or by carefully rewriting the affected section. But when the error could not be concealed, the page was discarded, and the scribe bore the weight of that waste in silence. The pressure to avoid such errors could make the work physically exhausting. Hours of holding the quill just so, of controlling every line, could leave the hand trembling by the end of the day. But trembling was dangerous. It led to slips, and slips led to failure. So the scribe learned to steady himself, to ignore the ache, to focus his entire being on the next letter, the next word, the next line. It was a kind of endurance that extended beyond the page. Perfection in writing mirrored the perfection expected in life. Just as the page had to be free of flaws, so too was the monk expected to keep his conduct free of sin. A crooked letter was like a lapse in discipline, a sign of weakness. The same patience, restraint, and attention to detail that shaped the manuscripts was expected to shape the soul. And yet, even in this relentless pursuit of flawlessness, there was room for something unexpected: beauty. The same hand that traced rigid lines could also bring life to the margins of the page, adorning them with intricate patterns and vivid colors. The work might have been born from duty, but it could still carry a spark of joy, hidden perhaps, but undeniably there. That spark would take a different form when the task shifted from simple copying to the illumination of letters, where the scribe's pen was replaced by a brush, and perfection was measured not just in form, but in light and color. Illumination was the closest thing a medieval monk had to a celebration. In a world of silence, fasting, and rigid precision, it was the one moment when color was allowed to bloom on the page like a rebellion no one dared to punish. The work began with a single letter, often the first letter of a chapter or psalm, drawn larger than the rest, a proud shape waiting to be dressed. Around it, the scribe would sketch winding vines, curling leaves, tiny flowers, sometimes animals or mythical beasts. It was a miniature world unfolding in the margins, a quiet burst of imagination hidden inside a book that otherwise demanded total obedience to the original text. But these decorations were not whimsical doodles. They were carefully planned, often symbolic, each color chosen with meaning. Blue was the color of heaven, red of martyrdom, green of hope. Gold, real gold, beaten into thin sheets and applied with painstaking care, was the light of God himself. When the page caught the sun, the gold would flare as if the words themselves were illuminated from within. The process of applying it was delicate, almost ritualistic. First came the adhesive, often made from a sticky mixture of glaire, egg white whipped to a froth, and a powdery gesso. Then the gold leaf, so thin it could tear at the slightest breath, was laid gently on top. A soft brush smoothed it down, and finally it was burnished with a small polished stone until it gleamed like fire trapped in the page. The paints, too, were born from patience and labor. There was no reaching for a ready-made tube. Each pigment was ground by hand from minerals, plants, or even insects. Lapis lazuli, the source of the richest blues, came from distant mines in Afghanistan and was worth more than gold. Vermilion red came from powdered cinnabar, a substance both beautiful and toxic. Green might come from crushed malachite, yellow from saffron or orpiment. These pigments were mixed with egg yolk, honey, or gum arabic to make them bind to the page. The colors were so vivid that, even after centuries, many still look fresh today. For the monk, this part of the work was both a challenge and a relief. The challenge was in the precision. One slip of the brush could mar the design, and unlike ink, paint could not always be scraped away. The relief was in the freedom. While copying text demanded that every letter match the original exactly, illumination allowed for a degree of personal expression. The style of the flowers, the curves of the vines, even the choice of colors, these could reflect the hand of the artist. In a life where individual identity was often swallowed by the collective rule of the order, these tiny artistic decisions were a quiet act of selfhood. Some illuminations were playful, even mischievous. Margins sometimes held strange little scenes, rabbits chasing hunters, monks riding snails, or grotesque creatures peeking out from behind vines. To a modern reader, they might seem like absurd jokes, but to the monks, they were both entertainment and coded messages, a reminder that even in the most solemn of texts, there was space for wit. Perhaps it was their way of keeping the mind alert during endless hours bent over the page. And yet, even here, the spiritual purpose was never far away. Illumination was meant to glorify the Word of God, to make the book a worthy vessel for the truths it carried. The colors in gold were not there to distract, but to draw the reader deeper into the sacred text, to make the very act of reading feel like entering a holy space. A beautifully illuminated manuscript was as much a work of devotion as the prayers spoken in the chapel. It was a prayer made visible. The hours spent on a single decorated letter could be staggering. A monk might spend an entire day painting the flourishes around one initial, building it up layer by layer until it seemed to almost breathe on the page. Larger illustrations, full-page scenes depicting biblical events, could take weeks or even months. In those moments, time seemed to stretch, the outside world fading until all that existed was the monk, his brush, and the glowing surface of the parchment. But, as with every other part of monastic life, this beauty came with discipline. The gold and pigments were expensive, and waste was unthinkable. Every stroke had to be intentional, every color mixed in just the right amount. And when the illumination was finished, the page had to be protected from smudges, fingerprints, or the accidental drip of ink from the next section of text. The work was slow, deliberate, and fragile. One careless move could undo days of effort. When the illumination was done, the page was transformed. It was no longer simply a record of words, it was an object of beauty, a treasure in itself. For the monk who created it, there was no public recognition. His name would not be recorded, his identity swallowed by the anonymity of the scriptorium, but perhaps that was the point. The glory was not meant for him. In the quiet, with the gold still catching the light and the colors still wet, the work was offered to God alone. And once the last stroke was in place, there was no pause for admiration. The book still had to be finished, the endless lines of text still waiting to be copied. The hands that had created blossoms and gold would return to the rigid, unyielding discipline of the script, the beauty of the margin giving way to the monotony of the body text. And all the while outside the scriptorium, the rules of the monastery still loomed, ready to remind the monk that beauty was never the goal. Obedience was. Cold was not a season in the monastery, it was a constant presence, a silent companion that followed the monks from the moment they woke to the moment they lay down again in their narrow cots. Even in summer, the stone walls held on to the chill of long winters past, exhaling it into the corridors like the breath of a sleeping giant. The air inside was damp, heavy with the scent of stone and old wood, and in the early hours before dawn it could feel as if the very air resisted the warmth of the human body. The cold was a teacher, and its lessons were harsh. It taught you how to write with fingers that no longer felt the quill, how to chant while your breath came out in pale clouds, how to kneel on flagstones that seemed to pull the heat from your bones. The scriptorium, the heart of a monk's labor, was rarely any better. Narrow windows let in light but no warmth, and the draught found every gap in the walls. Oil lamps offered a faint glow but almost no heat. If you held your hand too close to the flame, you risked smudging the parchment with the soot that clung to the air. Winter was the worst. The morning bell would drag the monks from their beds into corridors colder than the cells themselves. The first steps out of bed were a shock, the stone floor biting at bare feet like ice. There was no fire to greet them in the chapel, only the flicker of candles, whose light promised warmth but delivered none. The robes, heavy as they were, offered little insulation, and beneath them the body shivered constantly, muscles tightening in a futile effort to keep the blood warm. Writing under these conditions was an act of willpower. The ink thickened in the chill, sometimes freezing along the edge of the inkwell, forcing the monk to hold it near a candle just long enough to make it fluid again, but warm it too much, and the consistency would change, the lines would blur, and the day's work would be compromised. The quill felt stiff in the fingers, the joints aching from the cold, and every letter required concentration not just to shape, but to keep the hand from trembling. The cold found its way into everything: food, water, even the moments of rest. Bread, already hard, became almost unbreakable in winter. Water from the well was icy enough to numb the teeth. At night, the thin blanket trapped a little heat, and some monks would wake with frost along the edges of their robes. Illness was common: coughs that lingered for weeks, fevers that burned briefly but dangerously. Yet in most cases, the routine did not stop for sickness unless the body was truly unable to move. There were no grand complaints about the cold. It was accepted as part of the discipline, a test as constant as fasting or silence. Some even believed it strengthened the soul, forcing the monk to rely on inner fire rather than the comfort of the flesh. The discomfort became part of the prayer, each shiver offered up as penance. And, in a strange way, it shaped the community as much as the shared work did. They were bound together not only by faith, but by the shared endurance of the same unrelenting chill. Still, there were rare, small mercies. On particularly brutal days, the abbot might allow a brazier in the scriptorium, its faint warmth a luxury that felt almost sinful. Monks would gather subtly closer to it, pretending to work as normal, but stealing moments to let the heat reach their frozen fingers. These were the kinds of comforts that, in another life, would have been taken for granted, but here they became unforgettable. The cold also played tricks on the mind. Hours of shivering could dull concentration, making the words blur on the page, the meaning slipping away as the body fought to keep itself alive. In those moments, mistakes became more likely: a crooked line, a misplaced word, a blot of ink from a trembling hand. The mistakes were costly, not just in materials, but in pride. A monk who prided himself on precision could feel that pride fracture under the weight of the cold's relentless interference. But the cold was not the only thing that tested them. If it had been, perhaps the life could have been endured with nothing more than thicker robes and stronger will. Yet in the monastery, the physical trials were always paired with spiritual and mental ones, as if to remind the monk that the true battle was fought on more than one front. And in that constant testing, one figure stood as both guide and judge: the abbot, whose rules and presence could shape a monk's entire existence, for better or worse. The abbot was not merely the head of the monastery, he was its embodiment, the living rule by which every monk measured his life. His presence could fill a room without a single word, a gravity that bent every conversation, every movement, into alignment with his expectations. To newcomers, his gaze was the first trial, steady, unblinking, as if he could see through skin and bone into the thoughts you had not yet confessed. There was no comfort in his smile, if he smiled at all. It was a rare, almost unsettling event, and never casual. He held in his hands the rhythm of the monastery's life. The bell might signal prayer, meals, or work, but it was the abbot who decided when it rang, how long it tolled, and for what reason. His interpretation of the monastic rule shaped everything: the severity of the fasting, the enforcement of silence, the length of the nightly vigils. Some abbots were known for their strictness, their unwillingness to bend even in the face of sickness or old age. Others allowed small mercies, but even then, these came wrapped in the warning that mercy could be withdrawn at any time. The rules were absolute, but their weight depended on his temperament. If the abbot believed discipline had grown lax, the monastery might find itself under sudden reforms: harsher fasts, longer hours of labor, fewer allowances for rest. Such changes were not debated, they were announced, and the monks adapted or broke under them. In a world where obedience was the highest virtue, disobedience, no matter how small, was a fracture in the soul. Even a sideways glance during prayer could be noticed, remembered, and addressed later in private. And yet, the abbot's authority was not built only on fear. In the medieval mind, he was both father and shepherd, responsible for guiding each soul in his care toward salvation. His severity was framed as love, the kind of love that denied comfort for the sake of eternal reward. To him, leniency could be cruelty if it allowed a monk to drift toward sin. This meant that every correction, every punishment was delivered not merely to maintain order, but to shape the soul into something worthy of heaven. The punishments themselves were rarely physical. They were spiritual and social. A monk who broke silence without permission might be required to eat his meal standing apart from the others. A scribe who neglected his work might be assigned menial labor for a week, his precious hours with parchment replaced by hauling water or scrubbing floors. In extreme cases, public confession before the whole community was demanded, the offender kneeling while the abbot pronounced his fault aloud. These moments carved themselves into memory, not just for the one punished, but for everyone who witnessed them. The abbot's approval was just as potent as his disapproval. A nod from him after a service, a brief word of praise over a completed manuscript, could feel like a blessing worth months of labor. Such gestures were rare, and their scarcity gave them power. Monks learned to read his smallest expressions, a raised eyebrow, a slight narrowing of the eyes, and adjust their behavior accordingly. And life under his authority became a kind of unspoken conversation, a constant awareness of what might please or displease him. For the young or newly arrived, this was the most difficult adjustment. In the outside world, personal ambition or talent could carve a path forward. Here, everything depended on obedience. A brilliant illuminator, a gifted singer, even a monk with unmatched knowledge of Scripture, none of it mattered if the abbot saw in him a lack of humility. The greatest virtue in his eyes was not skill, but the willingness to serve without question. Some abbots became legends in their own right, their reputations, spreading beyond the walls of the monastery. Tales of their discipline, or their severity, were told in other houses, shaping how novices imagined monastic life before they even entered it. A strict abbot could be spoken of in the same hushed tones as a saint or a tyrant, depending on who told the story. In either case, his influence was undeniable, but authority in the monastery was never without its tensions. Even among men who had taken vows of obedience, there were unspoken resentments. A decision seen as too harsh, an order that felt unjust. These could fester in silence, especially when the rules touched on the small daily hardships everyone endured. The abbot knew this, and part of his role was to keep such discontent from poisoning the unity of the house. Sometimes that meant tightening his control. Other times, loosening it just enough to let the pressure ease. It was a delicate balance, one he maintained with the same precision the scribes used in their manuscripts. Too much strictness could break a man, too much leniency could make him careless, and while the abbot's gaze was constant, it could not be everywhere. In the quiet corners of the monastery, away from his sight, life sometimes unfolded in ways he would not have approved. Small rebellions, hidden comforts, and moments of humanity that the official rules never acknowledged. And it was in those hidden spaces, far from the abbot's watchful eye, that the true endurance of monastic life revealed itself. Not in the grand gestures of obedience, but in the unspoken bonds between the monks, in the quiet agreements that made the days bearable, even under the cold and the rules. Yet these bonds existed alongside another truth, that no matter how united they were in spirit, their ultimate purpose was to create something that would outlast them all, something that carried the weight of eternity in its pages. The manuscripts the monks created were not meant for a season or even a lifetime. They were meant for eternity. Every page was a vessel for words considered sacred, a container of knowledge that could outlast kingdoms and empires. The awareness of this permanence was both a burden and a calling. When a monk bent over a sheet of parchment, he was not simply copying text. He was carving it into the future, ensuring that long after his body lay in the earth, his work would still speak. The materials themselves seemed to echo this sense of endurance. Parchment, made from carefully prepared animal skins, could survive for centuries if stored properly. Its surface had a slight translucence, a living quality that paper could never match. In the dim light of the scriptorium, the letters seemed to float just above it, as if they were not written but suspended in time. The ink, brewed from soot, iron salts, and plant extracts, was chosen for its stubborn permanence. Many of the pages written in those cold stone rooms are still as sharp today as when the last stroke of the quill dried. The process of making a book was nothing short of monumental. First came the preparation of the parchment, stretching, scraping, smoothing until it was free of imperfections. Then, the layout of the text was marked with faint lines to ensure even columns, an invisible architecture beneath the words. The copying itself could take months or years, depending on the size of the manuscript. Larger works, like a complete Bible, could require decades and the labor of many hands, each one carefully matched to the style of the others, so that the final product appeared as if made by a single, tireless scribe. Every stage demanded precision because there would be no second chance. If a sheet was ruined, it meant the loss of a costly resource and weeks of labor. The knowledge that one slip could undo so much was a constant pressure, shaping the monk's every movement. Yet it was this very pressure that gave the work its gravity. Without it, the pages might have been rushed, the lines uneven, the letters careless. Instead, they carried the weight of a lifetime's discipline in every stroke. But the physical durability of the manuscript was only part of the story. Its true permanence lay in the ideas it preserved. In an age when books were rare and literacy rarer still, a single manuscript could shape the beliefs of generations. A prayer copied in one century might be whispered by lips in another, continents away. A commentary written by a long-dead theologian could influence decisions made in courts, churches, and councils hundreds of years later. The monk who copied those words might never know their reach, but he understood their potential. That understanding made the work sacred. This sacredness extended beyond religious texts. While scripture was the core of their labor, monks also preserved works of philosophy, science, and literature from the ancient world. Without their tireless copying, much of what we know of Greek and Roman thought might have been lost to time. The monastery became not just a house of prayer, but a fortress of memory, guarding the fragile thread of human knowledge against the erosion of war, disaster, and neglect. There is a quiet paradox in this legacy. The men who created these works lived lives of anonymity, their own names often unrecorded, while the words of others they preserved were immortalized. Their task was to erase themselves from the work, to leave no signature, no mark of individuality. And yet, in the rhythm of their handwriting and the small imperfections no two scribes could share, a trace of their humanity slipped through. Centuries later, a scholar studying an ancient manuscript might recognize the hand of a single monk across multiple volumes, a silent voice speaking across the ages. Finishing a manuscript was not a moment of celebration so much as quiet relief. The book would be bound by skilled hands, often within the monastery itself. Wooden boards covered in leather protected the pages, and sometimes metal clasps were added to keep it shut, preserving the parchment from the damp. If the manuscript was intended for a great cathedral or a wealthy patron, it might be adorned with jewels, silver, or more gold, transforming it into a treasure as much as a tool. Once complete, the manuscript entered a new phase of life. Some remained within the monastery's library, used daily in worship or study. Others traveled far, carried by messengers, or gifted to rulers and bishops. In each case, the journey of the book was unpredictable. It might be cherished, neglected, or even stolen. Yet as long as it survived, it carried within it the long hours, aching hands, and silent devotion of the men who had created it, and there was always the unspoken knowledge that the book could outlive everything around it. The monastery could fall to ruin, the brothers buried in unmarked graves, the abbot's name forgotten, but the manuscript, if spared from fire or water, could endure. In that way, the monks were building not just for their own time, but for a future they would never see. It was a kind of immortality, not for themselves, but for the words they served. Still, there was a cost to this devotion, one not measured in ink or parchment. To live a life so entirely given to work meant surrendering much of what made life sweet: laughter, conversation, the warmth of human connection. The manuscript might last forever, but the man who made it faded quietly into the background of history. And yet, for most, this was not a tragedy. It was the fulfillment of their vow, to disappear so that something greater could remain. But the monastery's walls held more than just silent endurance. They held small acts of rebellion, human flaws breaking through the rigid surface of discipline, marginal notes scribbled in the corner of a page, complaints about the cold, sly jokes disguised in ornamentation. These were the fingerprints of men who, despite their vows, still lived, still felt, still longed. And it is in these tiny glimpses that we see the other side of their story, the side that history rarely records, but that speaks perhaps the loudest of all. If the official history of monastic life is written in ink and gold, the unofficial one hides in the margins. To a casual reader, these decorated borders might seem like nothing more than flourishes, vines, flowers, and the occasional strange creature, but to those who know what to look for, they are a map of quiet rebellion. The same monk who spent his days in obedience to the abbot's unbending rules sometimes found a way to smuggle a piece of himself into the work, a trace of humor, frustration, or longing that slipped past the walls of discipline. In some manuscripts, you find tiny scenes tucked between the lines: a rabbit chasing a hunter, a snail engaged in battle with a knight, a monk slumped in exhaustion at his desk. To modern eyes, they might seem absurd or whimsical, but in a world where every gesture was monitored, such drawings were acts of remarkable audacity. They were harmless enough not to invite punishment, yet they carried a message. Life here is not only prayer and labor, it is also the stubborn beating of a human heart. And not all rebellions were visual. Sometimes they were written, squeezed into corners where they could be missed by a hurried reader. A marginal note might grumble about the weather, it is too cold to write, or complain about the quality of the parchment. One scribe in the 15th century left a weary plea in Latin, "I am very tired." Another, after copying a particularly long text, ended with, "Thank God, it will soon be dark." These voices echo across the centuries, reminding us that the monks were not silent machines, but men whose bodies ached and whose patience sometimes wore thin. There were also hints of competition in these margins. In some monasteries, multiple scribes worked on the same book, and the keen eye can spot small jabs, one scribe subtly correcting another's work, or leaving a note about the quality of a predecessor's hand. While the rule demanded humility, pride in craftsmanship was difficult to extinguish. The desire to be the best scribe, the most precise hand, was a quiet undercurrent in the life of the scriptorium. The margins also became a space for coded memory. Monks might draw a flower that grew only in their childhood village, or a bird, native to a place they once knew. To anyone else, it was just decoration. To the monk, it was a moment of home brought into the cloister, a private pilgrimage on parchment. In rare cases, even small portraits appear, faces hidden among the foliage, perhaps representing a fellow monk, a patron, or someone from a life left behind. This quiet defiance was not always about breaking rules. Sometimes it was a way to keep sanity intact. The monotony of copying could wear down even the most disciplined mind, and the act of slipping a tiny joke or memory into the page was a spark of life in the endless repetition. It was a reminder that, despite the vows, they were still themselves. The work might belong to God, but the margins could still belong to them. And it wasn't just in the books that these traces appeared. In the wood of the scriptorium desks, carved initials can still be found, small letters etched deep into the grain, probably during moments when the mind wandered or the hands sought a different task. In the stone walls, faint scratches mark where someone traced patterns idly while waiting for a task to begin. None of these were meant to be public. They were for the man himself, tokens of existence in a place where individuality was meant to vanish. Even the way some monks handled their tools could speak volumes. A quill carved with extra care, decorated with subtle grooves, an ink pot with a small mark that only its owner would recognize. These objects, while ordinary to an outsider, could become deeply personal in an environment where possessions were few and simple, but such acts, small as they were, carried risk. If an abbot considered a margin drawing or a written complaint to be inappropriate, the page could be scraped clean and the scribe reprimanded. The balance lay in knowing how far one could go without crossing the invisible line. And so, the art of rebellion in the monastery was as much about subtlety as courage. The survival of these traces is itself a miracle. Many manuscripts were rebound, trimmed, or damaged over the centuries, and yet countless tiny drawings and notes remain, a silent testament to the fact that humanity cannot be entirely erased, even in the most controlled environments. They are not the official voice of the monastery, but perhaps they are the truest one, the unguarded words and images of men who lived, worked, and dreamed inside walls built to contain them. And in this, there is an irony. The manuscripts were created to preserve sacred texts and noble truths, but they have also preserved the very things the monastery tried to suppress: individuality, humor, impatience, longing. These fragments in the margins bridge the centuries more vividly than the main text ever could. They remind us that the life of a monk was not only about devotion and discipline, it was also about survival, not just of the soul, but of the self. Yet survival in the monastery was not only about keeping a private spark alive, it was also about enduring the grinding repetition, the endless cycles of prayer, work, and silence that could stretch a single day into what felt like an entire season. And in that repetition, the true nature of monastic endurance revealed itself, something both harder and more human than the perfect lines of ink on a page. Life in the monastery was measured not in days or hours, but in cycles, predictable, unchanging, relentless. For the monk, time was not his own, it belonged to the bell. The first strike before dawn was not simply a wake-up call, it was a command. Even in the deepest sleep, the body learned to respond instantly, rising in the cold darkness without hesitation. The day began as it always did, with prayer. Not a rushed, sleepy murmur, but a long, deliberate chanting of the divine office, voices weaving together in a sound older than any man in the room. From there, the hours unfolded according to a rhythm that rarely shifted. There was work, there was prayer. There were meager meals taken in silence, and then more work, more prayer. The routine was so deeply ingrained that a monk could live through years of it without ever needing to ask what came next. It was a life designed to strip away choice, to remove the distractions of deciding how to spend one's time. In theory, this freed the soul to focus entirely on God. In practice, it was also a test of endurance, because when every day is identical, the weight of repetition becomes its own form of trial. The work in the scriptorium filled the largest portion of the day. Hours were spent hunched over parchment, copying letter after letter, line after line. The steady scratching of quills was the soundtrack of their existence. Sometimes a monk might pause to flex his cramped fingers or adjust his aching back, but there was no true break. Even when not writing, there were tools to sharpen, ink to mix, parchment to prepare. The mind was rarely idle, yet rarely free. Meals punctuated the day, but they were no feast. A bell would signal the community to gather in the refectory, where long wooden tables were set with simple bread, vegetables, and, on rare days, fish. Conversation was forbidden. Instead, one monk would read aloud from scripture or the writings of the saints while the others ate. It was a reminder that even in eating, the focus should remain on the soul, not the body. Once the meal ended, they filed out in silence and returned to their duties as if the pause had never happened. Prayer broke up the work into smaller sections, the hours of the divine office marking the passing of the day like the hands of a clock. Each service had its own psalms, readings, and chants, all memorized through constant repetition. Over time, the words became second nature, flowing from the lips without conscious thought. This was by design. The monks were meant to live in a state where prayer was as automatic as breathing. And yet, the human mind resists too much sameness. Some monks found comfort in the predictability, feeling anchored by the rhythm. Others felt the slow creep of monotony, the way the days blurred together until the seasons were the only sign that time was moving at all. Winter meant more darkness and colder work in the scriptorium. Summer brought longer daylight hours, but not necessarily more freedom. The rules remained the same, and the hours unbending. The repetition extended beyond the daily cycle into the year itself. The church calendar dictated the spiritual seasons: Advent, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, and these were marked by changes in prayers, readings, and fasting schedules. But even these variations were predictable, returning in the same order year after year. A monk who had spent decades in the cloister could anticipate every fast, every feast, every shift in the liturgy long before it arrived. It was in this endless repetition that the monastery revealed one of its deepest truths. Endurance was not about surviving hardship once, but about facing it again and again without faltering. The cold, the hunger, the strict silence, these were not occasional tests but constants woven into the fabric of every day. And the work itself mirrored this. The scribe's task was never truly done. When one book was finished, another waited. When one page was complete, the next lay blank before him, demanding the same attention, the same precision, as if nothing had been accomplished at all. This could wear on the spirit as much as on the body. The temptation to drift into distraction was always there, a wandering thought, a memory from life before the monastery, a longing for something different. But the rhythm of the day was designed to pull the mind back, to leave no space for such desires to grow. Every bell, every prayer, every repeated task was a tether, keeping the monk anchored to the life he had chosen, or perhaps the life that had been chosen for him. And yet, even in this cycle, there were moments that broke through the monotony. A particularly beautiful illumination, the sudden warmth of sunlight through the window, the rare taste of something sweet on a feast day. These small flashes of beauty carried a weight far greater than their size. They were reminders that even in the strictest life, joy could still appear, unexpected and brief. But such moments were always fleeting, and the routine would close in again, as steady and unchanging as the sound of the quill on parchment. Over time, the routine shaped the monks as surely as the quill shaped the letters on the page. Their bodies learned to wake before dawn, to work without complaint, to pray without wandering. Their minds became attuned to the cycle, finding meaning not in change, but in constancy. And perhaps this was the true purpose of the repetition, not to crush the spirit, but to train it, to teach it to find God, not in extraordinary events, but in the steady hum of daily faithfulness. Still, no matter how disciplined, no monk could escape the other constant of monastic life, the weight of the rules. If the cycle was the skeleton of the monastery, the rules were its sinews, binding every action to the will of the order. And those rules, unyielding and ever-present, shaped not only how the monks worked, but how they lived every waking moment within those walls. The rules of the monastery were not suggestions. They were the bones of the life inside those walls, the invisible architecture that dictated every movement, every word, every breath. They governed the obvious things, when to pray, when to eat, when to work, but they also reached into the smallest details of existence, places where an outsider might not even think rules could apply. And yet here, there was a regulation for everything. How a monk entered a room, how he folded his hands when seated, how he greeted a superior, even how he handled the tools of his trade. These rules were rooted in the Rule of St. Benedict or similar monastic codes, documents written centuries earlier that still shaped life as if they had been carved into the very stones of the cloister. They emphasized obedience, humility, and the subjugation of personal will. In practice, this meant that a monk's preferences, his tastes, his moods, his impulses, had to be erased in favor of what the order required. If the bell rang, he rose. If the abbot assigned a task, he obeyed without question. There was no bargaining, no negotiation, no just a moment. Even the act of speaking was bound by rules. Silence was the default, and permission to speak was a privilege, not a right. When words were allowed, they had to be brief, purposeful, and free of anything resembling gossip or idle chatter. To speak too much, too loudly, or at the wrong time was considered a failure of discipline. The same applied to laughter. Joy itself was not forbidden, but loud or disruptive mirth was frowned upon. This did not mean monks never laughed, but it meant they learned to do so quietly in moments that could pass unnoticed. The rules reached into physical behavior as well. A monk could not simply walk where he pleased. Movement within the monastery was deliberate, restrained. Posture mattered. Slouching was discouraged, as it was seen as a sign of laziness or inattention. When working in the scriptorium, one sat in the same way every day, quill in hand, body steady. Meals were eaten slowly, without waste, and every scrap left on a plate was considered a failure to value God's provision. There were rules for the care of tools and materials, too. Ink was to be prepared in a certain way, quills cut at precise angles, parchment stored so it would not warp. If a monk damaged a tool through carelessness, it was not simply an accident, it was a lapse in stewardship. The objects of their labor were not just property, they were part of the sacred work, and treating them poorly was an offense to the purpose they served. Perhaps the most difficult rules were the ones that controlled the mind and heart. Monks were instructed to guard their thoughts, to resist pride, envy, or anger before they could take root. This meant constant self-monitoring, a quiet battle that raged beneath the surface of the daily routine. Even if no one else could see a sinful thought, God could, and so the monk was accountable for it as much as for any visible action. The confession of such thoughts was encouraged, a practice that kept the conscience sharp, but also meant there was no true refuge from the gaze of discipline. Disobedience, even in small things, could lead to correction. Sometimes this was gentle, a word from the abbot, a reminder of the rule. Other times it was more public, such as being made to confess a fault in front of the community or being assigned extra duties. For repeated offenses, there could be harsher consequences: loss of privileges, isolation from the group, or fasting beyond the normal schedule. The aim was not revenge, but reform. The monastery saw itself as a forge, and the rules were the heat and hammer that shaped the soul into something pure. Yet rules could also serve as a shield. In an environment where every monk was bound by the same expectations, favoritism had less room to grow, at least in theory. No one could claim special treatment if the rules were applied evenly, and the clarity of what was required removed the uncertainty that plagued life in the outside world. For some, the strict boundaries were a relief, a way to set aside the chaos of personal choice and live entirely within a framework that had already been decided. Still, there was an ever-present tension between the letter and the spirit of the rules. Some monks followed them outwardly, but found small ways to bend them, taking an extra moment before rising at the bell, lingering just a little too long in the warmth of the kitchen, slipping a second piece of bread when no one was watching. Others became rigid enforcers, more concerned with catching a brother's faults than with their own humility. In this way, the rules not only shaped the community, but revealed its fractures. What made these rules so enduring was not their strictness alone, but their integration into every part of life. They were not an external set of laws that one could pick up and put down. They became the air the monks breathed, the pattern their bodies followed without thinking. Over time, they did not just live by the rules, they became the rules, their habits and instincts aligning with the order's demands, until there was little separation between the man and the code he followed. But even in such a tightly controlled world, there remained one last realm that belonged entirely to the monk's craft, the manuscripts themselves. For all the regulations about posture, silence, and precision, once ink met parchment, a different kind of discipline took over, a discipline that did not just shape the monk, but preserve the world's memory. And in those pages, under the weight of centuries, the line between rule and creation blurred into something greater than either on its own. The completed manuscript was more than an object. It was the monastery's heartbeat made visible. Each one was the sum of countless hours of labor, sacrifice, and silent devotion, a bridge between the fragile lives of men and the unyielding march of time. When a monk held a finished volume in his hands, bound in leather and secured with clasps, he was holding something that could, with care, outlast everything he knew. The monastery might one day crumble, the names of its inhabitants fade from memory, but this book, this patient work of ink, parchment, and will, had a chance to endure. The binding was the final act of protection. Wooden boards, covered in calfskin or goatskin, were chosen not just for beauty, but for strength. Some bindings were plain, their simplicity a statement of humility. Others, intended for great churches or noble patrons, were adorned with jewels, embossed designs, or plates of engraved silver. The clasp served a practical purpose, to keep the pages tightly shut, protecting the parchment from damp air and the slow warping that could come with centuries. When opened, the smell of the book was distinct, a blend of aged leather, animal skin, and the faint sharpness of iron gall ink, a scent that seemed older than memory itself. These manuscripts were treasures in the truest sense. In a world where books were rare and literacy rarer still, a single copy of the Gospels or collection of Psalms could command a value equal to land or gold. But their worth was not only material, it was spiritual. To read from one of these volumes during Mass or prayer was to draw directly from a source crafted with devotion at every stage. Each page was both a physical artifact and a vessel of the divine. Some books never left the monastery, kept in the library as a permanent part of its soul. These were stored in chests or chained to lecterns, both to protect them from theft and to ensure that they could be read communally. Others traveled far, gifted to bishops, kings, or newly founded churches. Such journeys were perilous. Fire, war, and theft claimed many volumes before they could fulfill their purpose. And yet, against the odds, thousands survive today, each one carrying the silent fingerprints of the men who made them. The survival of these manuscripts is a testament to the vision that drove the monks. They were not writing for themselves, or even for their immediate audience. They were writing for a world they would never see. A scribe who began copying a Bible in his 20s might not live to see it completed, yet he worked on it with the same precision as if it were his own final offering. This sense of building for eternity gave the labor a weight that no amount of monotony could strip away. And within those pages, the soul of the monastery lived on. The precise letters, the glowing gold, the careful margins, all reflected the values that shaped the men inside those walls. Discipline, humility, beauty, and service of truth, but sometimes, hidden in the corners, were also the traces of humanity that refused to be erased. A tired note in the margin, a small flourish in the lettering, a sketch no larger than a fingernail. These were not mistakes. They were reminders that even in a life built on self-erasure, the self still found ways to remain. For historians and scholars, each manuscript is not just a text, but a living document of its maker's world. The materials reveal trade routes and resources. The handwriting reflects regional styles. The pigments tell of distant mines and markets. Every page is a map, tracing the intersection of faith, art, and the fragile human hand that joined them. In this way, the manuscripts outlived their creators not just in years, but in meaning. A monk might vanish from history entirely, his name unknown, his voice unheard, yet through the book he copied, his work still moves eyes and minds centuries later. Every reader who turns those pages becomes, in a way, his final congregation. It is a legacy that carries a quiet irony. The monks gave up the world to live in silence, yet through their manuscripts they continued to speak. They sought humility, yet their work became immortal. They lived by rules that erased their individuality, yet their individuality survives in every curve of ink. This is the paradox of their craft. In serving something greater than themselves, they secured a form of presence they never sought. And so the book rests, whether in a museum case, a library vault, or still on the lectern of a small church, its pages holding not just the words it was meant to preserve, but the story of those who made it. The stone walls where it was born may be gone, the cold cells empty, the daily bells silent, but the work remains, stubborn against the passing of centuries. For the monks, this was never about glory, it was about service, about answering the same call day after day until the body could no longer rise to meet it. Yet in that quiet service, they built something that would reach far beyond them, something that would carry their discipline, their sacrifice, and their hidden humanity into futures they could never imagine. And perhaps, in the end, that was the truest reward of all. Not praise, not recognition, but the knowledge that their labor had become part of the unbroken thread of memory, binding the past to the present and carrying it forward into the hands of those yet to come. The manuscript was never just a book. It was the monastery itself, distilled into parchment and ink, waiting patiently for the next set of eyes to open it and, without knowing, meet the men who made it.